Sam's ship lurched violently as it tore through the atmosphere of the unknown planet. Every warning light flashed red, and the shrill sound of alarms played in his ears. His hands gripped the controls as he fought to keep the vessel steady, but nothing he did seemed to matter. The ship had sustained too much damage. The hull was compromised, and the fuel reserves were almost empty. It was only a matter of time before the ship would plummet to the surface. There was no escape, no way out of this. His mind raced as he stared out the viewport at the darkening skies outside. A vast storm was brewing, and the winds howled like 1,000 beasts. He could feel a tug of gravity, pulling him downward faster and faster. His body slammed into the seat as the ship entered its final descent. He was going to die here on this strange world, a place he had never meant to visit. He had been on a routine expedition when a freak malfunction had caused everything to go wrong. Now, he was paying the price for his curiosity, for daring to venture into the unknown. He could only hope that his crash wouldn't be too painful. Before the end came, his breath was shallow, his hands were slick with sweat. And as he closed his eyes waiting for the inevitable impact, he wondered if anyone would even know what happened to him. But then something changed. A sudden flash of light illuminated the sky outside the viewport, a blinding streak that shot across the heavens faster than anything he had ever seen. His breath caught in his throat, and for a split second, he thought he had imagined it. But the next moment, the ship jolted again, this time more violently than before, as if something had grabbed it and was holding it in midair. His heart raced in disbelief. There was no way something could stop a ship like his from crashing. It was impossible. But something was happening outside, something he couldn't understand yet. Before he could process what was happening, the ship's descent halted with a violent snap. His body pressed against the harness in a moment of weightlessness. Then suddenly, the ship dropped again. But this time the impact was soft, the kind of impact that should have been impossible after falling from such a height. The craft settled onto the surface of the planet with an eerie calmness. Sam blinked in confusion, his head spinning as the ship rocked gently to a stop. Was it really over? He didn't have time to process it before the hatch of the ship hissed open with a hiss, and a figure stepped into the cockpit. The air seemed to thrum with energy, and Sam's breath caught in his throat. Before him stood a tall alien warrior, her presence commanding her body, clad in sleek armor that seemed to shimmer in the dim light of the damaged ship. She towered over him, her face fierce and proud, with sharp features and glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. She was unlike anything he had ever seen. Her alien form exuded an intimidating strength, but her gaze was intense and focused on him alone. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was deafening. Sam's mind raced. Was he hallucinating? Was this some sort of alien rescue? Or was she the one who caused his crash? Sam couldn't make sense of it all. His heart pounded as the truth settled, and the strange alien was here to save him, or so it seemed. Without a word, the alien warrior extended a hand to him, her grip firm, but not threatening. There was something about her, something that told him this was no ordinary alien. This was something more, something that could change everything he knew about the universe. He hesitated for only a moment before reaching out and accepting her help. The alien warrior's hand was cold to the touch, but there was strength in it, something raw and unyielding. As she pulled him from the cockpit and onto his feet, Sam stumbled, but her grip held him steady. His mind raced with questions. Who was she? What did she want? How had she saved him? She said nothing as she helped him out of the wrecked ship, her eyes scanning the horizon as if expecting something to happen. Sam followed her gaze, but saw nothing. The world around them was a desolate stretch of rocky plains. The sky was darkening with storm clouds, and the air felt thick with an unnatural tension. He could feel the weight of her presence beside him, but the silence between them was unbearable. She finally spoke. Her voice was deep and resonant. It carried an authority that Sam had never encountered before. She asked if he was all right, but her tone was not one of concern. It was more like a commander assessing a soldier's readiness. He nodded despite the pain in his chest, his body sore from the crash. But he didn't dare show weakness in front of her. She was an alien warrior, and Sam wasn't sure what kind of power she held. The warrior studied him for a moment, then turned and began to walk away. Sam hesitated, unsure whether to follow, but the decision was made for him. She called over her shoulder and told him to follow her. Without question, her voice left no room for argument. He quickly moved to catch up to her, his feet stumbling in the thick sand beneath them as he tried to match her long strides. Despite her armor, she moved with an effortless grace like a predator stalking its prey. Sam couldn't help but feel a little in awe of her. The way she moved was almost hypnotic, each step full of purpose and deadly intent. They walked for what felt like hours in silence. Sam wanted to ask her 1,000 questions, but something about her presence kept him from speaking. It was like she radiated an unspoken command that made him feel small, insignificant in comparison. It was then that he realized she wasn't just saving him, she was studying him. Finally, they reached a small ridge that overlooked a valley below. In the distance, Sam could make out the flickering lights of a structure. It looked like some kind of outpost, maybe a base, but it was unlike anything he had seen before. The alien warrior stopped at the edge of the ridge and turned to face him, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made his heart race. "This is the beginning," she said, her voice low but firm. "You are here for a reason, not by accident. Your planet is on the brink of destruction, and I need you to help us stop it." Sam blinked, trying to process her words. Her meaning was clear, but the implications were too much to grasp in a single moment. Before he could respond, she continued, "The empire that rules this galaxy is ruthless. It has conquered countless worlds, and now Earth is next." Her words hit Sam like a physical blow. His mind struggled to keep up with the gravity of her statement. "You're the key to turning the tide." Sam's world tilted on its axis as the alien's words sank in. His home planet Earth was in danger, and he had somehow become a part of a war that spanned the stars. He wanted to ask more questions to understand how this all worked, but the warrior's next words silenced him completely. "You will fight alongside us, but there's something you need to understand." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "This war will change everything about who you are." Sam swallowed hard, his throat dry as he met her gaze. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this kind of change, but there was something about her conviction, something in the way she spoke, that made him feel as if this was his destiny now, no turning back. Sam stood frozen as her words echoed in his mind, the gravity of the situation settling over him like a heavy cloak. He had never signed up for this, never thought he'd be caught up in some intergalactic struggle. But here he was standing on the edge of a foreign world, facing an alien warrior who claimed his planet was about to be destroyed. He tried to speak, but the words didn't come. His throat felt tight, like his body was rebelling against the reality he was being forced to accept. Vera, the alien warrior who had saved him, watched him closely, her eyes never leaving his face. She could see the doubt and fear that clouded his thoughts, but she didn't soften her gaze. There was no room for hesitation in this war, and she knew Sam had to understand that if he was to survive, much less help them win. "You may think this isn't your fight," she said, her voice cutting through the tension, "but the moment you crashed here, you became a part of it. Whether you like it or not, the Empire's reach is vast, and it will not stop until every free world is under its control, including Earth." The words hung in the air like a dark omen. Sam finally found his voice. "But I'm just one man. What could I possibly do to stop something so powerful?" His words felt weak, even to himself. He wasn't a soldier, he wasn't a warrior. He was just a scientist who had ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time. Vera's expression softened for a brief moment, but her resolve didn't waver. "You are more than you think, Sam. Humans are not like any other species in the galaxy. Your ability to adapt, your resilience, your refusal to bow to any enemy is unlike anything we've ever encountered. That is why you are important." Sam looked down at the ground, trying to process what she was saying. She made it sound so simple, but it was anything but simple. He felt out of his depth. He wanted to run away, to take the next ship back to Earth, and forget all about this. But there was no going back now. He had seen too much already. "What exactly do you need from me?" he asked, his voice shaky but determined. Vera stepped closer, her presence almost overwhelming. "I need you to be a symbol, a leader," she said quietly. "The Empire has crushed countless rebellions by focusing on their leaders. But you, Sam, you're different. You're not one of us. You represent something they can't understand, the human spirit, the refusal to be defeated, even when all seems lost." Sam's heart raced. He felt a mixture of fear and pride. The thought of becoming a symbol for an entire rebellion was overwhelming. He had never led anything before, much less a fight against a galaxy-spanning empire. But he knew she was right about one thing: humanity's resilience was something unique. It was what had kept his species alive for centuries in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all they needed. Vera's hand reached out and placed it gently on his shoulder. "You won't be alone, Sam. We fight together." Her words were simple, but they held more weight than any battle plan she had ever devised. The war was theirs to win, but it wouldn't be easy. They would face impossible odds every step of the way. Sam nodded slowly, looking up at the darkening sky, the storm clouds swirling overhead, as if reflecting the turmoil in his mind. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: his life had changed forever. He was no longer just an explorer. He was now part of something much larger, something that could change the fate of the entire galaxy. The days that followed were a blur of constant motion, training, strategy, and more questions than answers. Sam's mind was a whirlwind of confusion. He had barely begun to grasp the enormity of what was happening when he was thrust into the chaos of the rebellion. Vera worked tirelessly to teach him what he needed to know about war and survival. But no matter how hard he tried to absorb it all, it still felt like a dream, a nightmare that he couldn't wake up from. Vera's methods were unorthodox, brutal at times, but effective. She pushed him harder than he ever thought possible, and even though the training left him sore and exhausted every morning, Sam couldn't deny the changes he saw in himself. His body was adapting quicker than he ever expected. Each day, he felt stronger, more aware, more capable of handling the dangers that were to come, but his mind still struggled to catch up with the reality of his new life. They traveled in secrecy, moving from one hidden base to the next, always staying one step ahead of the Empire's ever-watchful eyes. Sam found himself growing closer to Vera during these long days. The bond between them formed out of necessity at first, but now it was something more. There were moments when they would exchange looks in the midst of a mission, a brief moment of understanding between them. Sam began to respect her, not just as a leader, but as someone who understood the weight of their cause, someone who was willing to sacrifice everything for the greater good. He realized that she was no longer just the alien warrior who had saved him. She was his ally, his equal. They spent long hours planning their first major strike, a daring raid against an Imperial supply convoy. The plan was risky, but it was the only way to disrupt the Empire's supply lines and send a message that the rebellion was alive. And well, Sam had never been in a real fight before, but the thought of it didn't scare him as much as he thought it would. In fact, it felt strangely empowering. He had a purpose now, and he was ready to do whatever it took to protect the people of Earth. The night before the mission, Sam found himself sitting alone, staring at the stars above him. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed irrevocably. Since he'd crashed onto this alien world, his life was no longer his own, and that thought both terrified and exhilarated him. Vera approached him, quietly sitting down beside him. Without a word, she looked up at the sky, her expression unreadable. Sam glanced at her, not sure what to say, but she broke the silence first. "You are ready, Sam," she said, her voice soft yet firm. "The Empire will never expect someone like you to lead this fight, but that is why we need you. Your humanity, your drive to survive and protect, will be what carries us forward." Sam looked at her for a moment, trying to process her words. He still didn't fully understand what she saw in him, but he trusted her in a way he had never trusted anyone before. "Do you think we can win?" Sam asked quietly. Vera's gaze remained fixed on the stars as she answered, "We have to, or else everything we fought for will be for nothing." There was a quiet intensity in her voice that made Sam feel the weight of her words deeply. They were about to embark on a mission that could change the course of the war and the future of the galaxy. The next day, they set out for the convoy attack. Every step they took was calculated, but there was an undercurrent of uncertainty beneath the surface. The Empire was vast and powerful, and they were but a small band of rebels fighting for survival. Sam couldn't help but wonder if they were truly ready for what was coming. But as they approached the convoy, his fear began to fade, replaced by something else, something stronger: the desire to prove that humanity was capable of standing tall, even in the face of the greatest threat the galaxy had ever known. The night was thick with tension as Sam and Vera's team moved silently through the shadows. The convoy they had been tracking for days was now within their reach. The plan was simple and dangerous: disrupt the convoy, destroy its supplies, and send a message that the rebellion was far from defeated. Sam's heart pounded in his chest as he crouched low behind a rock formation, his mind racing with the weight of what was about to happen. There was no turning back now. They had committed to this strike, and failure was not an option. Vera crouched beside him, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon, her expression unreadable in the dim light. She had been quiet throughout the preparation, each movement calculated, each word deliberate. Sam couldn't help but wonder what was going through her mind as she silently prepared for the battle ahead. He respected her strength, but there was something else too, something that he couldn't quite put his finger on. She wasn't just a warrior, she was a leader. And in that moment, he realized just how much he was relying on her guidance. The convoy was heavily guarded. There were at least 24 Imperial soldiers securing the perimeter. The cargo transports themselves were massive, reinforced with armor and heavily armed. Sam knew that this wouldn't be easy. It was one thing to train for combat, it was another to actually face it. But he had no choice now. There was no more running. Vera signaled to the team, and they moved quickly into position. Sam's nerves were on edge as he adjusted his blaster. It felt unfamiliar in his hands. Despite the hours of practice, his grip was tight, and his mind kept wandering back to Earth, back to the life he had left behind. Was this really the right thing to do? Could he really fight an empire for something as abstract as freedom? Could he live with himself if things went wrong? But Vera's voice broke through his thoughts, her tone low and steady. Focus, Sam, remember what we're fighting for. He nodded, barely hearing her words, as the signal was given and the attack began. Explosions rocked the ground as the first blast hit the convoy. It was a chain reaction, each explosion sending shockwaves through the ground as smoke and debris filled the air. Sam felt a rush of adrenaline, his body moving on instinct. He fired his blaster at a nearby soldier, watching as the man collapsed to the ground. In an instant, the impact of the shot sent a surge of realization through Sam's chest. He was no longer a scientist. He wasn't just a bystander in a fight for survival. He was a part of something bigger now, something that demanded his action. The battle was chaotic. Everything was happening so fast. Blaster fire crackled through the air as soldiers shouted orders. Sam found himself moving in a haze, his senses on high alert. As he took down another soldier, then another, his hands worked on autopilot, while his mind raced, trying to make sense of the whirlwind around him. Vera was a blur of motion beside him, her movements swift and deadly, cutting through the enemy ranks with an efficiency that left no room for hesitation. Sam couldn't help but marvel at her skill, how every strike she made seemed to have purpose and precision. But there was no time to think about that now. He had to stay focused if they were going to win. The convoy was in disarray. The Imperial soldiers were scattered, some retreating, others fighting back with desperation. Sam and Vera's team pushed forward, each movement bringing them closer to their target, the cargo transports they needed to destroy the supplies inside, to cripple the Empire's hold on this sector. But there were still soldiers between them, and the convoy's heart, and Sam felt the pressure mounting with each passing second. Just as they reached the convoy's first transport, Sam saw a figure move in the distance, a shadow against the chaos, someone who wasn't part of the rebellion, an Imperial officer. Perhaps. Sam didn't hesitate, his blaster raised, and in one fluid motion he fired the shot. The officer collapsed to the ground, and Sam's heart skipped a beat. But before he could process the moment, Vera's voice cut through the noise again. "Keep moving, Sam, we're not done yet." Her words grounded him, pulling him back into the mission, and he rushed forward, his pulse pounding as the final phase of their plan came into action. The explosions continued as the transport doors blew open. The rebel team planted charges inside, and the cargo hold was set to detonate. Sam didn't know if the mission had been a complete success yet, but he knew one thing for certain: the rebellion was no longer a whisper, it was a roar. And they were just getting started. The blast sent shockwaves through the ground. Sam felt the heat of the explosion. Even from a distance, his heart raced as the convoy was engulfed in flames. Smoke billowed into the air, rising like a column of defiance. The mission had been successful, but it was far from over. As the enemy regrouped and more soldiers began to rush toward their position, Sam's mind snapped back into focus. He was still alive. But the fight wasn't done, yet the convoy was destroyed, the supplies had been reduced to rubble, but the Empire's presence was far from gone. Vera didn't wait for any of them to catch their breath. She was already moving quickly, and with purpose. She was a blur of motion, leading the way through the battlefield, her hand signals precise, her orders clear. Sam and the rest of the team followed without hesitation, each of them falling into the rhythm of battle, as if they had been fighting together for years. Sam could feel the adrenaline surging through him, his body acting on instinct as he fired at any soldier who came too close. He didn't think about it anymore, didn't hesitate, he just acted, and with every shot that hit its mark, he felt more like a part of this new world he had found himself in. The Imperial soldiers were relentless, they were trained, they had numbers, but they lacked the drive that the rebels had, the conviction that burned deep in Sam's chest. He could see it in their eyes. The rebellion wasn't just a cause, it was a fight for survival, for everything they held dear, for freedom, and the belief that they had the right to protect their homes, even if it meant facing down an empire that was far stronger than they were. Sam had no illusions about the odds they faced, but in that moment he didn't care. All that mattered was that they were fighting for something worth fighting for, and that was enough. Vera was by his side in an instant, cutting through the enemy lines with deadly precision. Her movements were flawless, and Sam couldn't help but admire her strength. In the chaos of the battle, he found himself learning from her, not just in strategy, but in spirit. He saw how she carried herself, how she inspired the others to fight with everything they had, and something within him clicked. It wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about the future, about the legacy they would leave behind for the next generation, and for the generations after that. As the last of the soldiers retreated into the smoke and dust of the battlefield, Sam allowed himself a brief moment to breathe. He scanned the area, taking in the destruction around them. The convoy was completely obliterated, the Empire's supplies were in ruins, but there were still more challenges to face, more battles to fight. But for now they had won this one, and it felt like a victory that mattered. Vera approached him once the dust began to settle, her eyes scanning the area for any remaining threats before she turned to him, her expression unreadable. But there was a slight nod of approval. "You did well, Sam," she said quietly, her voice calm, but with an edge of something deeper in it. Sam couldn't tell if she was proud or if it was something more, but her words made him feel like he had earned his place here in this fight alongside her and the rest of the rebels. "We're not done yet," Vera added as her gaze shifted back to the horizon where more smoke rose from the wreckage of the convoy. The war was far from over, and Sam knew this victory would be short-lived. The Empire would retaliate, they always did. But for the first time since he had crash-landed on this alien planet, Sam felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. They had struck a blow against the Empire, and for the first time in a long while he believed they had a chance to win this war, to change the future of the galaxy forever. The aftermath of the battle felt like a strange kind of silence. As the dust settled over the wreckage, Sam looked around at the smoldering remains of the convoy. The fire was still burning, but there was no more fighting. The air was thick with the scent of burning metal and scorched earth. But in that moment, Sam realized something else: the battle had been won, not because of the technology or the weapons they had, but because of the spirit that drove them forward. It was something raw, something deep and powerful that none of the Empire's forces could ever replicate. Vera stood by his side, her posture still rigid, as she surveyed the scene, her eyes narrowing as she assessed the damage they had caused. But her face showed no sign of relief, no sense of victory. It was as though the battle was only a small piece of the war, and the real challenge still lay ahead. Sam found himself feeling the same way. They had struck a blow to the Empire, but it was only one battle in a war that seemed endless. How many more would they have to fight? How many more would fall before they could win this? Vera broke the silence with a single word: move. And without hesitation, Sam followed her and the rest of the team as they made their way toward the transport they had hidden nearby. The rebel forces had already begun regrouping to prepare for their next move. The battle had been a success, but there was still so much to do. As they traveled back to their base, Sam found his thoughts drifting back to the planet he had left behind, the one that had felt so far removed from this world of war and conflict. It seemed impossible that a few days ago he had been an explorer simply searching for new discoveries. Now he was part of a rebellion fighting for the survival of his people, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was only just beginning. Vera spoke to the team as they moved. "This was just the beginning," she said, her voice unwavering. "The Empire will come after us harder than before, but we have shown them that we are not weak, we are not to be underestimated." Sam couldn't help but feel the weight of her words. They weren't just a rallying cry. They were a statement of fact. The Empire's response would be brutal, but the rebellion was growing, and with each victory, no matter how small, they were proving that resistance was possible. They reached the rebel base later that evening. The place was a maze of tents and makeshift structures. The hum of quiet conversations filled the air as soldiers and strategists worked together to assess the next steps. Sam noticed the looks of respect that followed Vera as she entered the command tent. She had earned her position through years of bloodshed and sacrifice. But there was something else too, something about her leadership that inspired those around her. Sam saw it in the way the other rebels spoke to her, in the way they followed her orders without question. It wasn't just her skill, it was her belief in the cause that made people want to fight by her side. Vera turned to Sam as they entered the tent. "Rest," she said, her voice softer than before. "You've earned it." Sam was surprised by the order, but he didn't argue. He knew she was right. The last few days had been a whirlwind of action and exhaustion, but now that he had a moment to breathe, he realized just how much the battle had taken out of him physically and mentally. The weight of everything was starting to sink in, but he knew he couldn't stop now. As he lay down on the cot in the corner of the tent, Sam stared up at the ceiling, his mind racing with thoughts of the future, of the rebellion, of the Empire's inevitable retaliation. He wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing for certain: he was no longer just a passenger in this fight. He was a part of it, and there was no turning back now. The following days were a blur of constant planning and preparation. Sam had barely had time to recover from the battle before Vera and the rest of the leadership team were already discussing their next move. The Empire would retaliate soon. They all knew it. It was only a matter of time before they came looking for revenge. The question was, where would they strike next? And how could they stay one step ahead? Sam couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in his chest. There was no easy way out of this fight. Every victory seemed to come with a heavier price, and the Empire's reach was only growing. He spent most of his time in the command center helping with intelligence gathering and analyzing data from the mission. Their success had been a blow to the Empire's logistical network, but it had also made them a target. The Empire would be more vigilant now, more aggressive. Sam knew they had to keep moving, but he also knew that they couldn't afford to make any mistakes. One wrong move could end everything. Vera continued to lead with unwavering confidence, but Sam could see the toll the war was taking on her. He noticed how her eyes seemed more tired than before, how the weight of responsibility had started to show in her posture. She never complained, she never slowed down, but Sam knew that even she had her limits. Still, she was a rock, a constant in the ever-shifting landscape of their struggle, and that gave him strength when he doubted himself. It wasn't just Vera who had changed, though the whole base had a different energy now. A quiet kind of determination had taken root among the rebels. They had seen what the Empire was capable of, and they had learned to fight back. Sam had seen it firsthand, how they operated, how they kept moving. No matter the cost, there was no giving up, no matter the odds. The Empire's cruelty had only strengthened their resolve, and Sam couldn't help but feel that he too was beginning to understand what it meant to truly fight for something greater than himself. On the fourth day after the mission, Sam was sitting alone in the mess hall when a soldier approached him. His name was Jarek, and he was one of the newer recruits. Sam had seen him around, but they hadn't had much time to talk. "Hey Sam," Jarek said with a hesitant smile. "I just wanted to say thanks for what you did back there. I'm not sure any of us would have made it without you." Sam blinked, surprised by the gratitude in the soldier's voice. "I didn't do much," he said. "It was a team effort." Jarek shook his head. "It's more than that. You stood your ground out there. You didn't freeze up like most would. Have you fought? And because of that, we're still here." Sam wasn't sure how to respond, but he gave the soldier a small nod, grateful for the recognition. He wasn't used to praise, but in that moment it felt good to know that he was making a difference. Later that night, as Sam lay in his cot staring up at the dark ceiling, he thought about Jarek's words, about the difference he was making for the first time since all this had started. He felt like he belonged, like he was more than just a scientist or an outsider. He was part of something bigger now, and that something had the power to change the fate of the galaxy forever. The following morning, the rebel leadership gathered in the command center. The mood was tense. They had received intelligence about a large Imperial fleet moving into the sector. They were not sure of their intentions, but everyone knew that they couldn't afford to wait, and Vera stood at the front of the room, her eyes scanning the maps and reports. Before her, she looked more determined than ever. "This is it," she said, her voice calm, but heavy with purpose. "We need to move quickly if we want to stay ahead of them." Sam felt the weight of her words. His stomach churned with the thought of facing such an overwhelming force, but he also knew what was at stake. This was their chance to strike back, to take the fight directly to the Empire, and he couldn't let fear hold him back. He stood up and walked over to the map, his eyes tracing the movements of the Imperial fleet. Vera looked at him for a moment before speaking. "We need someone to infiltrate their communications and find out what they're planning. Sam, are you ready?" Sam hesitated for a moment, but then nodded without a word. He knew that this was his moment, his time to step up and prove that he wasn't just a bystander anymore. He was in this fight for good, and whatever came next, he would face it head on. The mission was set, and Sam's nerves were on edge as he prepared to infiltrate the Imperial fleet's communication network. The plan was simple on paper, but Sam knew better than to underestimate the Empire's capabilities. It was going to be risky. His role was to get in and extract as much intelligence as he could about the fleet's movements before they were discovered. The stakes had never been higher, and the weight of failure hung heavily on his shoulders as he suited up and made his way to the transport. He couldn't shake the feeling that this could be his last mission. Vera was already waiting by the transport's hatch, her expression as unreadable as ever, but there was a fire in her eyes that Sam had come to recognize as determination. "You know what's at stake, Sam," she said as he approached. "If we fail, the Empire will be on us within hours. But if we succeed, we could turn the tide of this entire war." Sam nodded silently. He had heard the same speech many times before, but this time it felt different. This time it felt real. It felt like everything they had done until now had led to this one moment. He entered the transport and settled into his seat beside the pilot, who offered a brief nod before the engines hummed to life. The trip to the Imperial fleet was going to take hours, and Sam used the time to go over the plan again in his head. Every detail mattered. There was no room for error. Once they arrived at the fleet, he would need to be quick and precise in accessing their communication systems. There was no telling how much time they would have before the Empire realized someone was tampering with their network. The transport shook as they neared the fleet's orbit, and Sam's heart began to race. His hands felt cold. Despite the heat of the transport, he was on the edge of something huge, something that could change everything, and all he had to do was stay calm and focus. Vera's voice came through the comms, breaking the silence. "Stay sharp, Sam. Will be in position soon. We trust you." Her words carried more weight than he expected. There was a certain finality in them, like she was telling him that this was his responsibility and that they were all relying on him to make this work. Once the transport neared the Imperial fleet's perimeter, Sam could see the massive warships in the distance, their cold steel hulls gleaming in the dim light of the distant stars. It was an intimidating sight, but Sam didn't let it shake him. He had trained for this moment. He had trained for situations like this, and he wasn't going to let fear control him. He focused on the task at hand. He had to get in and get the intel they needed, no matter the cost. The transport glided into the shadows of the fleet's lower defense grid, and Sam slipped into his role as quietly as possible. He activated the cloak feature of his suit, blending into the surroundings like a shadow. His movements were smooth and calculated as he navigated through the tight corridors of the Imperial warship. He had studied their layouts in detail during the past few days. He knew where he needed to go and how to avoid detection. But even with all the preparation, there was always a risk. There was always the chance that something would go wrong. He reached the communication hub undetected, But as he approached the terminal, his pulse quickened. The security was tighter than he had anticipated. He was going to need to hack into their system without alerting anyone, and the clock was ticking. Every second counted. The mission was only going to get harder from here on out. Sam took a deep breath and plugged into the terminal using the override code he had been given. But the moment his connection was established, an alarm blared through the system, a shrill sound that sent a chill down his spine. Panic surged in him, but he fought it down. There was no time to hesitate, no time to waste. He quickly downloaded the fleet's plans, data rushing to extract every piece of useful information he could before security arrived at his location. Just as he was finishing the download, he heard footsteps approaching and knew he didn't have much time left. Sam yanked the data pad from the terminal and made his way to the exit as quickly as possible, but the alarms were growing louder and the air felt thick with tension. He ran through the corridors, his heart pounding in his chest, the sound of pursuing soldiers echoing behind him. There was no room for error now. Every wrong move could be his last. Sam pushed his legs harder, ignoring the burn as he made his way back to the transport. He couldn't afford to slow down. The Empire would stop at nothing to capture him, and if he didn't make it out in time, the rebellion's chances would be lost forever. Just as he reached the transport, a shot rang out, narrowly missing him. Sam jumped into the transport and yelled to the pilot to engage the engines. Without hesitation, they blasted out of the Imperial fleet's range and into open space. Sam collapsed into his seat, exhausted, but the data he had brought with him was invaluable. It was everything the rebellion needed to make their next move. Vera's voice crackled over the comms. "You did it, Sam." There was a pause before she added, "You saved us all." Sam looked at the data in his hands and realized that this was just the beginning. The war was far from over, but in that moment, he knew they had a fighting chance.